It's My Nerd World, a Star Wars show. I'm excited. Finally, a galaxy at war takes shape. I'll give you my thoughts on the Mandalorian episode, The Spies. More than one spy? A spy? Who's the spy? Where Mando is taking us, the sequels are getting context, and I'm more excited for Star Wars right now than I have been in a long, long time, based solely off of this week's Mandalorian. Plus, we have a lot of listener feedback to get to. Thank you so much for checking out this week's episode. Let's get it.
It's an instinct. A feeling. The Force brought us together. We're not alone. Good people will fight if we lead them.
People keep telling me they know me. No one does.
But I do.
Long have I waited. And now you're coming together. Is your undoing.
Confronting fear is the destiny of a Jedi. Your destiny. The Force will be with you.
Always.
My Nerd World.
It is My Nerd World, and welcome to it. I am your host, Jon Justice, here on a Star Wars show. We've got a lot of ground to cover. I don't want to waste any time. Let's start off with some of the news items this week. We'll move into rumors and where I think all of this is going and why I'm so excited today.
When I found you, I saw raw, untamed power. And beyond that, something truly special.
So you're going to get a little bit of everything today and a lot of hot takes from me. I tried to really boil everything down to its essence because I have just a lot of thoughts running through my head right now. Let's start off with a few news items in the wake of Star Wars Celebration in Europe last week. An article came out from Variety putting a little bit more context into the Star Wars movie that will take place after The Rise of Skywalker. The headline says a lot. Daisy Ridley's new Star Wars movie will find the Jedi in disarray 15 years after The Rise of Skywalker. One of the quotes from the story, as we move into the future space, this story is set about 15 years outside The Rise of Skywalker. Obviously, we've realized post-war, post-First Order Rise of the New Order, we left Episode 9 with Rey making a commitment to Luke Skywalker that she would rebuild the Jedi Order. There is storytelling taking place, and I'll break down what we know, my speculation, a little bit later on in the episode, that really sets up for sort of an open avenue, and I hope this is where they're going, an open avenue to tell this story of Rey and the new Jedi Order, making it essentially Episode 10 in terms of moving forward in the timeline, and I gave my thoughts on that last week. I won't repeat everything here now, but also telling a brand new story that isn't really connected to what came before it. What I mean to say is, in a bit of a preview, that by the time we get to Rey, 15 years after the Rise of Skywalker, you could have the galaxy in a position where there is no looming threat in the background. And that the Sith Order and the Battle of Exegol was really the culmination and the crescendo to the Empire and what Palpatine started, going all the way back to the Phantom Menace, and potentially even a little bit before that, depending on what we find out in the Acolyte. I'll explain this further as I get farther into the show. Another article came out from a Hollywood Reporter putting a little bit more light on when the films will come out. Lucasfilm would ideally like the return to theaters with the Rey-focused film and follow that a year later with Dave Filoni's movie, although nothing is set in due to timetables of the Mandalorian universe shows. So they do have a slot set for December 19th of 2025. And so right now the speculation is that's where the post The Rise of Skywalker, Rey New Jedi Order movie would fall. Dave Filoni's would then happen in potentially December the year after in 2026. Now, this creates a bit of an issue because we're supposed to get an Avatar movie in December of 2026. But James Cameron has said as of late that that movie could be pushed further, because I can't imagine a Star Wars and an Avatar movie coming out anywhere near each other, especially considering that Avatar The Way of Water made a combined total, as far as I know, of all three sequel movies. So that certainly is going to take precedent for Lucasfilm. Also, some of this, I believe, is going to be contingent on how successful the series is, because the line that they've given during the interviews through Celebration was that, well, there'll be a season 2 of Ahsoka depending on how successful it is. My understanding, based on some leaks that I know that I will not share with you now, is that end of the Ahsoka series could potentially go right into Dave Filoni's movie, but it does open up the possibility of a second Ahsoka series then going into Dave Filoni's movie. Honestly, I think it makes more sense to do Dave Filoni's movie and wrap up the storytelling of the live action shows from what I'll call, for the sake of the show, the Mandalorian era, post Return of the Jedi, pre The Force Awakens, and then follow that with a Rey building a new Jedi Order film. I think that makes the most sense, especially if you consider there's like a possibility that you could have a Grogu in a Rey movie, and I'll get to more of that later. Right now, though, the talk is Rey's movie 2025, Dave Filoni's 2026. Kathleen Kennedy also told Entertainment Weekly that the Star Wars crawl is coming back for the theatrical releases. So they are ditching the separate, different movie-specific intros that we got for Rogue One and Solo. Here's my prediction on this, by the way. My prediction is all the movies are going to get the crawl treatment, and that eventually in future releases, Rogue One and Solo will also have an opening crawl with no episode number, so that all the films will be consistent in their openings and will tell a timeline-specific narrative. That could be a little weird with Rogue One, but considering that Andor leads right into Rogue One, it makes a bit of sense. That Rogue One intro, I love Rogue One, the intro with the weird outlined Rogue One logo. The music's fine, but it just doesn't work. I liked what they did in Solo, where they opened up with a prologue that mirrored a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Personally, I think both those movies could benefit with a traditional Star Wars logo. Intro, the thunderous opening John Williams music into a crawl, then into the movies. And I personally would love to see that, because I think that those films and the entirety of the saga films all work well together if you watch them in succession. So that's my prediction. That's what we'll get. I have nothing to base that off of other than my own desire to go and see it happen. All right. Let's get into where we're heading with the Mando universe, how it relates to adding context to the sequel trilogy, and some behind-the-scenes news as well. So we'll start off with some rumors and then get into some contextual stuff.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
And honestly, we'll start off with some contextual stuff first, and we'll go behind the scenes, which I don't do all that often on the show, but I think it's kind of important to lay the groundwork of what may be happening behind the scenes as it relates to the storytelling that we're getting on our screens at home. All right, so according to multiple sources, and I was listening to the Sith Council, Christian Harloff's podcast, and I'm mentioning this because he's heard this rather specific rumor from two different sources that don't know each other, and one of these sources actually predicted that it was going to be, not predicted, said that they knew that a Dave Filoni movie was going to be announced at Celebration, and that happened. They had this rumor I'm going to share with you, and then so did a completely separate source apart from that. So, using sort of Christian Harloff's logic of how credible might this be, it sounds pretty credible. So the rumor goes as this, that Jon Favreau, the showrunner for The Mandalorian, okay, and Kathleen Kennedy from Lucasfilm, there was a rift between the two of them that almost had Jon Favreau leaving Lucasfilm. The rift involved Kathleen Kennedy's desire to get The Mandalorian back with Grogu in the Book of Boba Fett. Now, I mentioned this in a previous episode, and now I've got a little bit more context hearing this being discussed on other podcasts, and most specifically the Sith Council with Christian Harloff. So the thought was that, and my understanding of this was that Grogu going with Luke was going to be the plan, and that most likely Grogu was not going to rejoin with the Mandalorian, at least not as soon as he did. But because Grogu was so popular, that Kathleen Kennedy decided that they needed to get Mandalorian back with Grogu, and that's why we ended up with those 2 episodes in the Book of Boba Fett, and Jon Favreau didn't do that. This would lend a thread to what I presented last week, that the reason why Grogu's been somewhat sidelined in Season 3 of The Mandalorian was that he was never really supposed to be in it, and he wasn't part of the larger story. Okay. And then maybe Grogu was supposed to stay with Luke all along. Another part of this that I'm extrapolating is that, I don't care, but I'm just going to share it with you. This season of The Mandalorian is the lowest rated season of the 3 from the previous 2, with Season 2 being rated higher. A lot of people are sort of scratching their head over this going, why is this, what does this have to do with anything? Why is Mandalorian not doing as well? Well, I think it's because a lot of people, casual fans, watched the end of Season 2 of The Mandalorian and figured that was the end of the story. I mean, it was pretty final when you think about it. You had Luke Skywalker show up, spoiler alert. Grogu leaves with him. The Mandalorian is sad, but he's, finished his story arc, what his mission was for those 2 seasons. You have the bad guy defeated in the capturing of Moff Gideon. They have the cruiser, and the story kind of wraps up. I mean, in the way a lot of Star Wars stories do, where, of course, there's more story to tell, but in terms of those threads, all those, everything was tied up nicely. How many of those individuals went and watched the Book of Boba Fett? How many of them stayed through the Book of Boba Fett? And then how many of them watched the Book of Boba Fett and saw the 2 episodes with The Mandalorian and saw The Mandalorian get back with Grogu and then see him join up with Boba Fett at the end of the Book of Boba Fett? And that's kind of wrapped up with a bow, meaning there wasn't really anything in the beginnings of The Mandalorian Season 3 on a sort of what's going to happen. There wasn't really any of that. So I think that's why. I just don't think there was anything bringing people, the casual fans, back to the Mandalorian table. Okay, so that's the first rumor. The other rumor that's been going around is that there's also a riff with the voice actor, and now we can kind of call previous body actor of Din Djarin, the Mandalorian, Pedro Pascal. Now, Pedro Pascal. It's been documented that the whole reason why he ends up showing his face in Season 1 at the end was because he was becoming more well-known within the movie industry. He was getting a lot of success in other films, and no one was seeing his face, so they decided to go ahead and expose his face. And then we got more of his face in Season 2. And there's some speculation that now that he's become a bona fide movie star, that he's been so busy doing other things that all he's been doing is voiceover work, because we haven't seen his face at all. And it's fairly well known that it's been a completely different actor in the Mando suit for all of Season 3, that Pedro Pascal hasn't even been on set. He's just been doing ADR work for the voice of the Mandalorian. And the fact that he didn't show up at Star Wars Celebration. This is leading to rumors that he may not make it out of this season. Now, again, spoiler alert for this week's episode of Spies of the Mandalorian, we know that, well, he gets captured by Moff Gideon. I have a hard time believing that we would have a Season 4, and we are going to have a Season 4. Favreau announced that he wrote Season 4 scripts during the Season 3 post-production, stressing it's essential the scripts be done so that the series can continue to fit into and anchor the larger framework of the Star Wars universe. There are a handful of new Star Wars series on the way, including the highly anticipated Ahsoka. Season 4, yeah, we've already written it, said Favreau. We have to know where we're going to tell. We have to know where we're going to tell a fully formed story. We had it mapped out. Dave Filoni and I, and slowly you start to write each episode. I was writing it during post-production. All of this has to feel like a continuation in one full story. Now, again, there's no guarantee that Mando will be in it. And considering if Grogu wasn't originally planned to be back with Mando for the sake of argument, it's kind of fair game where he ends up, including potentially with Ahsoka, maybe going back to Luke Skywalker. There is some speculation out there that he could end up playing a part of Rey's post The Rise of Skywalker story. I mean, either way, where all these characters are during The Rise of Skywalker and the Battle of Exegol, that's what I'm dying to know. I'm really interested on how they're going to figure this out, just as much as I am going back to the Bad Batch and where is the Bad Batch going to end up, and specifically Omega during the time of the original trilogy. Okay, so with the groundwork being laid, where is this all going? Well, let me tell you, my speculation and hot takes on where I believe all of this is heading.
This is not going to go the way you think.
I'm not going to get into a story beat breakdown of the spies from this week, apart from some aspects of it that I'll get into in my commentary about where I think the story is going and why I'm so excited. I loved this episode. I really did. And it is making me, in retrospect, appreciate even last week's episode a little more for as goofy as it was. I think I was in a really bad mood last week when I watched it, which is probably why I was so harsh on it. But even going back to the Dr. Pershing episode and all the time we spent on Coruscant, it wasn't that long in terms of storytelling. We had a great bookend to that episode. Us Star Wars fans, we like to complain, myself included. Okay. I loved this episode. I loved seeing the Mandalorians that were on Mandalore. I was bummed that their sail barge vehicle that they were using to cross Mandalore got destroyed by that monster. I'm glad that we had just a quick moment with that monster, and it wasn't anything further. It was obviously there to drive them into the catacombs of Mandalore. I also think, as it pertains to Din Djarin maybe not making out of this episode and moving forward with The Mandalorian, I think it works. You could still have The Mandalorian show, and it's just about The Mandalorian, meaning multiple Mandalorians, right? The Mandalorian, which could be all of The Mandalorian, because you can use that as a plural. I think that's possible. We'll wait and see. I think it's highly unlikely. But that being said, I think it's it's in the realm of possibility, and a lot of people and I agree that this Season 3 has really been more about Bo-Katan than it has been Din Djarin, and in which case she's also a Mandalorian, so it fits. All right, so where's it all going? The Shadow Council from this week's episode of The Mandalorian is providing crucial context as to the Imperial remnants that are all loyal to Thrawn, except for Moff Gideon. We get Brendol Hux, for those that didn't know. One of the individuals that Moff Gideon during the Shadow Council's scene was Brendol Hux. This is General Hux's dad from the sequels, played by Dom Hall Gleason's brother. And Domhnall Gleeson, of course, played General Hux. So we've got it in the family in the real world, and then in the family in the fantasy world. Okay. I love this setup. It's giving us the background that I desperately wanted as we head into the sequel trilogy. And there's a bit of history repeating going on that I think is awesome. So you've got Moff Gideon clearly using the clones for his own purposes while also probably serving the Emperor and the Emperor's loyalists. Maybe even the Sith Eternal out way off in the background to find a suitable replacement for Palpatine, Snoke being on the way, the temporary one, and perhaps even an individual that could supersede Moff Gideon. But Moff Gideon clearly has his own agenda in play. He is not on board with following Thrawn the way the rest of the Shadow Council is. And this idea of Snoke coming into play, I think we got a bit of a precursor to that with the arrival of the Red Praetorian Guards in this episode. And by the way that they ended up taking out Paz Vizsla at the end of the episode, adding some context to how they operate with the Rey and Kylo fight from The Last Jedi, this is all the stuff that I've been waiting for. Things to add to the enjoyment of those films that I already love. I mean, these Praetorian Guards were not to be messed with. They were lethal, and they just straight up murdered him. Even in kind of a slow fashion as well, which, honestly, any little quips that I might have had with that Rey-Kylo fight in The Last Jedi, from a stunt coordinating standpoint, where you have the bad guys, multiple bad guys in a one-to-one fight with these characters, you know, they kind of go one-on-one with the characters until another bad guy shows up, and if you watch closely, you can see them sort of stalled. Having these Praetorian Guards take down Paz Vizsla added a bit of context that I really enjoyed. These new Dark Troopers are most likely, if you didn't pick up on it, Moff Gideon clones. He said as much. They advanced from the droid versions of the Dark Troopers, and they're special because they contain him. Moff Gideon has been using cloning to clone himself and create his own clone army. So before I get to an even bigger picture in this whole thing, I'm not sure what to expect next week. Again, will Din and Moff Gideon survive? Does Thrawn return now? And we see how he returns in Ahsoka? Because there's going to be a time jump in Ahsoka. We're going to jump to the finale of Rebels when Ahsoka goes and finds Sabine on Lothal to go find Thrawn, and then we'll have a time jump later on as they go and try to find Ezra, because there was a bit of time play taking place when we saw Ahsoka in Season 2 of The Mandalorian, when she ran into who we now know is a Night Sister, who will be one of the villains in the Ahsoka series, in that episode directed by Dave Filoni in Season 2. That episode took place prior to Ahsoka's going and finding Sabine. Okay. Also, they like to do big reveals in The Mandalorian. Okay. So we had the reveal of the Darksaber at the end of Season 1. Of course, we had the epic Luke Skywalker moment at the end of Season 2. One has to imagine that we're going to see some type of big reveal at the end of Season 3. Now, a lot of people have talked about, and even the director of this week's episode and next week's episode of The Mandalorian, the finale, said that there will be sort of a period put on the Book of Boba Fett. So it's kind of a given almost that Boba Fett will show up in next week's episode, but I don't think that's a big enough reveal to put on par with what we saw at the end of Season 2 of The Mandalorian. So what am I pointing to? Well, if you look at the timeline, we have a New Republic in play. We've had we spent some time with the New Republic on the New Republic base from 2 episodes ago. Carson ends up going and finding the Mandalorians on that planet. Who else is a part of the New Republic? Princess Leia. She's around right now. Now, how they handle a younger Princess Leia in this timeline, I do not know. But that would be pretty epic. I also think it's possible that because we saw Zeb from Rebels, there's a possibility we could get some Rebels in this. We could even get the Ghost in this, and maybe our first official non-trailer look at Hera. Either way, I think we're due for a pretty big reveal. And to me, a big reveal would be Leia showing up in the final hour to deliver the knockout blow to Moff Gideon and his troopers as the Mandalorians retake Mandalore. All right, so one more part of this and some speculation I want to get to before I get to listener feedback. As always, I want to remind you, love to hear from you. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com, or you can leave a comment on YouTube as well.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
All right. So let's go even bigger picture on this. This is what has me really excited. We've got history repeating. And I think this is awesome. In the Bad Batch, we're seeing the burgeoning empire go and take over the galaxy. But we're also seeing these side projects occurring, specifically as it relates to the continued desire to expand the cloning program in the wake of the Kaminoans being destroyed while still having a few of them there. And even though we've gone and replaced the stormtroopers, and I'll get to this with the clones, that's the story that we've been telling, we still know that cloning is taking place. Okay, I'll get back to that. The original trilogy at the time of its release seemed like a very large Fate of the Galaxy story. But it was really smaller in scope than we thought. And that's good. What I mean by that is what we're finding out now is that we have these Imperial remnants in place. The Empire wasn't as destroyed as we thought that it was. And that makes sense. For as large as the Empire had gotten, to think that the destruction of the Death Star 2 and the alleged death of Palpatine and cutting off the complete command of the Empire would certainly break its ranks down and allow a new republic to replace it as it relates to governing the galaxy. We're certainly seeing now that they're struggling to go and do that. But it takes the original trilogy story, which is fine, and really makes it a much, much more personal story in what we saw in those three films over a very short period of time in terms of the years in which we watched between A New Hope and then the end of Return of the Jedi. Now we're seeing that, as a matter of fact, the galaxy was in a lot more turmoil after that, and it matches in terms of scope, widening out the galaxy, something closer to what we saw within the prequels and certainly within the Clone Wars. All of these expansive planets. We kind of all knew that it was there as we were kids watching the original trilogy, but we've now been introduced to a much larger universe, and with the expansion of the storytelling post Return of the Jedi, we're seeing that even more. Okay, so it makes the original trilogy for me even more unique and personal, whereas the sequel trilogy does something very similar, albeit slightly larger in terms of the implication and finale to the story. Again, you have a personal story. You have a smaller rebellion that's pushing back over what we believe is a burgeoning new potential empire in the First Order. But what we're finding out is there were also other elements that were out there. So it takes the sequel trilogy, gives us a personal story of Rey and Kylo and Poe and Finn over the course of, again, a short few years. But by the end of it, you really have the complete finale and dismantling of the Empire with the final death of Palpatine and the alleged end of the Sith Eternal. Okay, so, history repeating. Clones. And this is what I also love. You've got, in the prequels, you've got the clones. They rise to power, Attack of the Clones, in terms of being the dominant military force. They are slowly decommissioned after the Clone Wars end, as we've been seeing in the Bad Batch, and the Stormtroopers rise. As we've talked about, cloning technology continues. The original trilogy Stormtroopers, from the time of what we're seeing in the Bad Batch through the original trilogy and then slightly into what we see post-Return of the Jedi, they kind of fade with the fall of the Empire, left to the Imperial remnants that we're beginning to see. Now we have the history repeating, where Moff Gideon, probably at the behest of Palps, is trying to repeat what had taken place before with the Clone Army. In essence, creating his own clone army based off of himself. Now, he is either going to fall in The Mandalorian or Ahsoka or maybe even the Filoni movie. This brings into context Kylo Ren's comment at the beginning of The Force Awakens when he's talking to General Hux about the potential failure of his clone in Finn, saying perhaps we need a clone army. Snoke's essentially a clone, and so is Palpatine. So I love this storytelling that really shows what we already know in terms of real world history, and that is if you forget about the past, you're doomed to repeat it. And we're seeing the same mistakes that are taking place over and over again from the prequels through the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy. Whether it's the rise and fall of potential empires, which is the last part of this that I'll get to, or it's the what army are we going to use, clones or real people, and the desire to go and do clones again, even though they kind of pushed them away and failed them later on. And the clones were obviously being used specifically for a larger purpose with Palpatine, but the way they're doing the storytelling, I just think it's awesome. And then lastly, we have the larger implications of the enemy forces here. And there's a layering taking place that I don't know how intentional it was. I have to believe that it was. But you have the Imperial remnants post-Return of the Jedi. Okay. They are now forming into what we believe is going to end up being a larger force led by Thrawn. In the meantime, we've got this First Order potential lingering in the background with these projects that Palpatine is working on. We're seeing the beginnings of that with this Shadow Council and the number of individuals as part of the Imperial remnants that are involved. And specifically, you have Brendel Hux, General Hux's dad, who's there as a former part of the Empire. The through line through him and then General Hux as it relates to the First Order is obviously there. We're going to see, most likely, the Imperial remnants completely absorbed by Thrawn when we get to the Dave Filoni movie that'll be the culmination of all the live-action shows that I've been talking about. The First Order grows. The Thrawn forces will more than likely be defeated. They will be absorbed by the First Order. The First Order rises with the Sith Eternal in the background. We have the First Order falling to a certain extent, but not really able to grab complete hold of the galaxy and the storytelling that we see within The Last Jedi and the fall of Snoke, and then they essentially end up in The Rise of Skywalker, absorbed by the Sith Eternal, ushering in Palpatine's ultimate return, which brings us full circle back to what Palpatine had in the first place in terms of his empire. And what I love about this, again, intentional or not, I think it's awesome, is that when you get to the end of the story that started with the Phantom Menace, you're back to what? Palpatine and a potential empire ready to go out and take on the galaxy and take it over once and for all, with the Final Order, with a whole bunch of Star Destroyers that look like the ones that we saw in the original trilogy. And this is where you get the final act where the Empire and Palpatine are once and for all completely defeated in the Battle of Exegol. This is fantastic storytelling, in my opinion. And this is what I've been waiting for. It didn't take as long for us to get there in The Mandalorian, but that's why I just got so excited with one episode of The Mandalorian brought me to this place where by giving us all right, we know that the I can't remember her name now. But the woman on Coruscant was working for Gideon. We saw her at the beginning of this episode. We get the Shadow Council, so you see all the remnants. We get Gideon working with clones, trying to build his own army. He's off by himself. We get the talking of Thrawn. They're waiting for Thrawn to come up. And then we also get the addition of these Praetorian guards, bringing all of this together. Finally, the galaxy war is starting to take shape, and I am 100% here for it. It's amazing to me how much my enthusiasm can change from one week to the other. What do you think, TalkShowNerd? Did any of that make sense? You let me know.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
Friend of the show, Ken. Long-time listener, first-time writer, he says. He also has been a fantastic beta reader for my EMBARK series of books. Getting back to last week's episode. Yes, the episode was somewhat entertaining, but it seemed to be aimed at a much younger audience than the rest of the season and stood out like a sore thumb. I struggled for a while to figure out what it reminded me of, and then it hit me. It was a Star Wars version of Scooby-Doo, starring Thelma and Fred. There was a chase scene, picking up clues, all the usual hijinks, and then it ended with the bad guy captured. The only thing missing was the unmasking of the villain and the signature tagline from the captured villain, and I would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling Mandalorians. While I don't expect the same level of maturity as Andor provided, I'm quite interested in your thoughts on the difference in the target audience between this episode and any of the others. I don't recall them doing anything this cartoon-like before. I just watched the next episode, Spies, and I almost forgot the weird taste of the prior episode left in my mouth. It makes the contrast even more easily observed, methinks. Mecha Grogu has some potential. Yeah, I thought Mecha Grogu was quite a bit of fun. I dug that as well. Yeah, I think they were just trying something new. I agree with you. It seemed to potentially be aimed at a younger audience, but oftentimes they'll take these episodes and they'll try to riff off of other things. I think your Scooby-Doo comparison is pretty close. I doubt that they sat down and said, let's make an episode that's a little bit more younger geared. I just think they went for it in terms of a different storytelling tone. Maybe they thought the next episodes were going to be too dark. It just didn't land for me and work. In context of the rest of the series, it's okay. It's enough for me to watch it for what it is. It's still Star Wars, and what I see on screen is still really fun to look at, even if all of it didn't land. All right, friend of the show, fellow iHeart employee, John Poliska writes, wanted to chime in on episode 22, episode 3.6, specifically about the cameos. I know a lot of people have been really critical about Jack Black and Lizzo. Maybe I'm just too accepting, but I didn't mind either at all. To be honest, in my first watch through, I didn't even realize it was Lizzo at first. Once I heard it was, I was kind of surprised I didn't recognize her. Remember, though, it's all subjective, right? Absolutely. There is an aspect of Star Wars that is supposed to be fun and unexpected, right? Yep. I kind of feel that's what they were going for. Plus, hearing about Lizzo or Jack Black in an episode could be what some people need to hear about for them to check out the show. If either end up being a long-running or reoccurring character, then sure, maybe there's a place there to have a larger debate about their presence in the galaxy far, far away. But as one-off characters, I thought it was fun and lighthearted. Yeah, Jack Black's character was maybe a little too over the top, but I'm sure there are people like that in all reaches of the galaxy. We just got a glimpse of one of them. Yeah, and, as somebody that tends to go and, apologize for Jar Jar Binks in The Phantom Menace, I see your point. I love all the content we're getting. Will all of it hit on all cylinders? Not for all fans all of the time. No, certainly not. But like you, I detest the people who will only find and promote the negative aspects of Star Wars. And more specifically, the Star Wars fandom. I'm all for critical discussion and conversation, but at the end of the day, it's a fantasy, and I just hope more people remember that and don't take things too seriously. Thanks again for your podcast and the time and dedication you put into it, John. Thank you, John. It's great to hear from you, man. I miss seeing you around the office. Irene Davis writes, you're all friends of the show, by the way. Back in business, John, so let's to it. Ray's movie, the series World Between Worlds, wow, wow, wow. I really thought they were going to stay stuck. Looking forward to your content, debate, and all the rest of it. Best wishes from the UK. P.S. I knew they had 2 published Ray writers at the time of the writing sessions. I think I even told you. Thank you for that, Irene. It's always good to hear from you. All right, let's go to Eliza Rodriguez. I have to disagree with you, John. I love this episode, last week's episode. Very prequels, Lucas and Clone Wars like. I can't wait for the next 2 episodes. Still love your show. Thank you for still liking the show, even though we disagreed on that. SheVP writes, I'm a chick who is a total sucker for romance. And even I usually fast forward the Padme Anakin fireplace scene. See, I like that scene. It's cheesy, but I like that scene. Not because of what Padme is wearing in a fire. Of course not. So when that quarantine scene ended, I remember thinking, good grief, this scene makes the fireplace scene look like Jane Austen. And the Lizzo scenes just felt like watching scenes out of Spaceballs or some parody. Just absurd. I hope they never do that again. I saw on Twitter that this episode is the lowest rated of the entire show. Not sure what the problem with Favreau is, but I truly hope he gets it back on track. I believe that he has. I was listening to a discussion yesterday, and the host was saying that his insider has told him that the season finale will be more divisive to the fandom than The Last Jedi. I'm nervous. Can't wait to see what's coming out of Celebration, though. This was obviously written before Celebration. Thank you, SheVP. Friend of the show. Always good to hear from you. Arcs Redemption writes, love this episode, honestly. It's just more complaining about quirky characters than Star Wars has always had them. Fair enough. Rey's relationship with Luke in The Last Jedi was tenuous at best, writes Brian Martin. Thank you, Arcs Redemption, for the comment. Brian Martin writes, Rey's relationship with Luke in The Last Jedi was tenuous at best, and most of her relationship with Leia was off-screen. So how is it even earned in any way for her to take the name Skywalker? Well, first off, Brian, at the end of The Rise of Skywalker, you see the Force ghost of Leia and Luke standing there, and they obviously approve of her taking the Skywalker name. So that in and of itself would be enough for me personally taking the Skywalker name. But her relationship with Leia was off-screen, and there was a year between what took place in The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker. So a lot obviously happened. They have a relationship at the beginning of The Rise of Skywalker. It was set up that way, the best that they could, given the fact that Carrie Fisher could no longer be with us to film for that movie, and based off of the fact that they had to go and use footage from the previous 2 films. So for me personally, on this fan, I mentioned before, I'll say it again, I had no problem with the justification of her taking the Skywalker name. And going back to what I laid out as it relates to the big picture of the storytelling, and really looking through the entire timeline based off of what we know now and what we're being told of the time period between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens, I think that the end of that film is even more poignant and powerful than it was before, and it gives Rey an even bigger right to take on the Skywalker name, considering the absolute finality to Palpatine at the end of the movie, the final end of his empire with the destruction of the Sith Eternal on Exegol, and the fact that the voices of the Jedi past gave her the motivation and perhaps even power to defeat Palpatine. I am all the Jedi. She deserved the name, in my opinion. Salvador Mendez writes, do you think the New Order movie is Episode 10? Yes. Will they name it Episode 10? No. Will we watch it after The Rise of Skywalker and think to ourselves, this is Episode 10? Yes, I believe we will. All right. Got a few more here. Miranda Alicia writes, I can't even begin to tell you how happy I am right now. Best day ever in terms of the news. And this was over the weekend after Celebration with the announcement of the films. As for the positives, there's always a reason to have something positive to talk about. Eventually, this season has given me, a sequel trilogy fan, a gift that I never would have expected to have. It reignited and gave me a new fire in myself, reminding me why I was passionate about Reylo, the Reylo community, and how it became one of the many positives out of the sequels. I'll bring it on here because the sequel lovers and Reylo fans, you and me, John. Reylo is alive and well and is cruising, but this time it's coming from Bo-Katan and Din Djarin, and I've seen this a lot. The creatives must have studied this part of the sequel trilogy, even if they never talk about it in an interview, but I know that they are secret Reylos deep down. I see what you're doing here. And for that, let's bring on Celebration, and maybe there's time for a Last Jedi viewing, because why not? So I have seen this. I'll wait to see how it plays out. I'm not putting a lot of stock in it, but basically there are people that are shipping Bo-Katan and Din Djarin. We'll see how all of that plays out. Thank you, as always, Miranda, for the feedback. All right, Mark writes, in a bit of a crossover here, talking a little bit Depeche Mode, my other podcast in Star Wars. I'll write up a review of the Sacramento and Las Vegas shows, but in the meantime, how cool was that new Ahsoka teaser? I'm also a big Star Wars fan. Not sure about the 3 new films. I agree that Lucasfilm needs to focus on theatrical releases versus Disney Plus content, although there's a case for both. I'm just not sure about any continuing story with Rey. Thank you for that, Mark, and glad to hear from a fellow Depeche Mode fan on my Star Wars podcast. And lastly, let's get to a friend of the show, Patrick. He says, this is a follow-up because you asked about last week's episode of The Mandalorian where there were minor issues I had with the episode as I marinated on it after the fact. I'll cover those first. The opening sequence I didn't get other than it shows us how Mandalorians were being mercenaries, which kind of felt they had already led us to already. So it was unnecessary and over the top. As for the guest stars and cameo, I agree. When I first saw them, it took me out of the episode. I had to pause it and scream at my wife that all these people were in the episode. Once I did that, I'll also admit I thought Lizzo could have done a better job, but I didn't expect much from her. To your point, maybe a miss by Bryce Dallas Howard as a director. Beyond that, I enjoyed the episode, and while I understand your point of view on it, I can say that I thought some of the story beats and jokes were telegraphed, and if you have history with Star Wars, you should have seen them coming, but it didn't take away from the episode for me. As for your point about how the Darksaber was handled at the end, I feel Din kept it until that point because it didn't need to be told, and handed it off at that point. Like you said, yes, we had a repeat to a degree of the scene from Rebels, but the reason she was able to hand it off made logical and story sense, and the Mandalorians who followed Bo would have been the only ones who cared how she earned the Darksaber anyway, so saving it till then made sense. And I think it was my son who pointed out to me that when she fought Axe Woves, she was fighting him to take control of the Mandalorian fleet. And when she beat him, he went and was using the Darksaber against her to try to one-up, and that's when Din decided to hand it over. So in retrospect, it made more sense. As for some of the other minor issues of the episode that you had, like the domes on a lush planet and the football running advanced battle droid, to me, that's a writer issue and not a director issue. The only issue I would lay at the feet of Bryce Dallas Howard is the Lizzo acting, and again, that could be wiped away as they may have forced that casting on her, and that might have been the best acting performance they could have gotten out of her. Yeah, you're probably right. Again, I think she gets Star Wars and is deserving of a movie of her own in a series down the line. I believe she's doing a lot of the directing for Skeleton Crew. Always love your podcast and listening to your opinions, whether we agree or not. May the Force be with you always, and this is the way Patrick Stoll. Thank you, Patrick. All right, and that wraps up the show for this week. Before I let you go, I would ask that if you want to support my Nerd World and the Star Wars podcast, I hope that you will take a moment and check out my EMBARK space opera series. If the world ends, who would you want by your side? Taft Guardia's answer was always fellow pilot Katha Morrow. She just doesn't know it. Now, as an industrial catastrophe sweeps across the planet, they'll have to survive long enough for her to find out. As two rival megacorporations are on the brink of interstellar war, thousands of starships are at risk as they head for deep space, and someone has given Taft a power he never wanted to stop the conflict. Reluctantly, Taft realizes he holds the key to saving Earth's evacuees. The odds are against him, but Taft has the advantage and will bravely have to choose between protecting Katha or risking humanity's future among the stars. Treat yourself to this fast-paced and action-packed scientific adventure. A friend or a family member. It's written for adults, but great for ages 11 plus. Buy EMBARK Book 1 today in ebook, paperback, audiobook, and hardcover. Also available I'm getting lost in my own words here. Amazon.com or mynerdworld.net. If you like your science fiction space opera to be epic, filled with some romance and action, EMBARK is perfect for you, a family member, or friend. Again, on Amazon.com or mynerdworld.net. On Amazon, search for Jon, Jon Justice. 7 books in the series completes the entire story. So I hope you go and check those out. Support the show if you haven't done so already. Until next week, and my thoughts on the finale of Mandalorian. I hope wherever you are happy, you're healthy, and you are safe. I'll talk to you then. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.